Welcome to VoteProPot-Cast, brought to you by VoteProPot.com. Hello, everybody, and welcome to episode 40 of VoteProPot-Cast. We're glad you're with us today. I'm Phil Adams.
I'm Jay Britton.
I'm Andrew McCready's.
Today we are covering a broad range of topics. There are a whole bunch of new jobs created by the cannabis industry. Andrew's got Leafly's latest cannabis job count report. Jay's going to talk about the co-creator of Viagra developing cannabis-based sexual enhancement for women. Andrew has a story on big marijuana. It is here, it is growing, and can the craft cannabis survive? I'm going to talk about the special interests that are still sticking around, sticking to their guns, and keeping marijuana criminalized. From there, we're going to talk about a tough new approach to medical marijuana by Nebraska. A $3.4 billion cannabis acquisition deal, and a new CBS poll about voters and cannabis legalization. But first, Andrew had quite an excursion on 420. Why don't you tell us about that, Andrew?
Well, actually, it was the week of 420. In Washington, they had the National Cannabis Policy Conference. And it was all day down at the museum in D.C. It started at 8:30 in the morning, went to 5 o'clock, and you needed coffee. Oh, boy, you needed coffee to get through this one, buddy. It was a lot of, they covered a lot of meat, and to get into it and to really give a synopsis would take a whole episode and would be kind of tedious. So I think in the next coming weeks, if we cover something that I've learned from that, I'll bring it up. So...
Well, what were some of the highlights?
Well, they discuss how the press affected the war on drugs, how, like so often, reporters would just embed themselves with drug task force teams and go on SWAT raids, and they're sort of given an impression of, an unrealistic impression of the drug war. And they talked about the massive incarceration issues, talked about different policies. A very interesting thing was brought up by the guy who heads the Drug Policy Alliance, Drug Policy Coalition Alliance. Anyway, he was talking about how, well, the subject was on racism and how it's had an effect on the drug war and drugs in general. And one of the gentlemen made the point that not only do we have to deal with racism, but we have to deal with something called drugism, and that is there's a definite prejudice against people associated with certain drugs. Now, I'd say all drugs, certain drugs. So, and that's sort of an issue we all have to deal with in the future. We got to stop stereotyping people.
And by certain drugs, do you mean illegal drugs or certain illegal drugs?
Illegal drugs. Definitely all illegal drugs.
Okay.
You know? Alcohol is somewhat celebrated, I'd say, in our culture, you know, whereas cannabis is not, or wasn't for a long time.
Right.
And that's showing a change in our culture, which we will discuss more and more on this podcast.
A welcome change, I think. Well, folks, if you have any insight about any of these topics or another topic, we'd love to hear from you. Check us out at VoteProPot.com.
Or send us an email at podcast@VoteProPot.com. Call our message line at 240-257-2441.
And please like and follow us and leave a comment on LinkedIn, Facebook, and Twitter. Just do a search for VoteProPot.
Andrew, you've got a report about jobs from the cannabis industry.
Yes, I do. Now, Leafly did something on their own. They went out and they went from state to state and worked with all these different people and Whitney Economics firm, which is a data
like a marketing research, yeah.
Right. And they did a jobs report because the United States government does not do it because it's federally illegal.
Right.
The cannabis industry in the United States is now up to 211,000 people.
Wow.
That's a good amount.
That's substantial.
Right. And more than 64,000 of those jobs were added in 2018.
Wow.
Which is pretty huge.
Yeah.
The cannabis workforce increased 21% in 2017. It gained 44% in 2018 and is expected at least another 20% growth in 2019. That would be 110% growth in 3 years, which is pretty huge. Now, what they're seeing in Washington and Colorado, the numbers, since they legalized in 2014, the numbers are leveling off. They're sort of plateauing,
Is that right?
which makes sense. But that just says that in the coming years, with more states legalizing and medical opening up everywhere, those numbers are going to explode in the next couple of years. So in 2022, 2023, when the number of adult use dispensaries is going to double or triple, there's going to be huge job growth. Now, there are certain states that they noticed that it really grew in the last year. One was Florida. Employment grew 703% in 2018.
Wow.
They added 9,000 jobs. Nevada added 7,500 jobs. Pennsylvania, at the beginning of 2017, had 90 jobs, and by the end of 2018, they had 3,900. Wow. New York grew by 278%, leveling up at more than 5,000 jobs. Now,
so when you see the unemployment numbers, you can shave a little bit off of that, even, right?
Right.
Yeah.
But there's certain
if you really get down to it.
Now there's more people in the cannabis industry than there are dental hygienists. There's only 60,000 people in the coal mining industry, and there's 211 in the cannabis industry, and no one's really talking about it.
Well, we're talking about it.
It's the fastest growing employment boom of any industry in the United States.
So those numbers put it in perspective.
In a while.
In a while, yeah.
Yeah.
And that's in a booming economy. So, you got to love those numbers. Men know about the little blue pill, but perhaps there's a little green pill for women in the offing. Jay, what do you know about that?
Well, the man that co-led the research behind Viagra and Cialis as well has been hired by a company by the name of Manna Molecular to develop a cannabis vaginal gel that will help women have a better sexual experience. So there you go. The interesting thing is the reason this came about is Manna Molecular makes these transdermal patches with CBD and THC, I guess, for different medical uses. Mm-hmm. And they started hearing from patients, women who said that when they put the patch in their genital region, that they had a much better sexual experience. So they went out and hired this gentleman, Dr. Haran Padma Nathan, to create a product. And they're working on that product now. So something to look forward to, ladies.
Well, I can imagine that the gel would work better because the patch could get in the way, wouldn't it?
Depends on where you put it. And
oh, yeah, okay. So I'm just wondering.
Let's leave it right there.
In this day and age when Americans of all political stripes seem to agree on just about nothing, the one issue that seems to have a lot of agreement is cannabis legalization. An overwhelming majority, or a significant majority, I think at last count it was 67% of Americans agree that cannabis should be legal. But the problem is that while the states seem to be one by one moving closer and closer to legalization, the federal government is still stuck on no. So what's the holdup? Well, according to this report by the Foundation for Economic Education, there are a number of, as you might expect, special interest groups who are finding that anti-marijuana business is astonishingly lucrative for bureaucrats, campaign donors, and others in Washington. And so who are these special interests? Well, according to the foundation, one of them is big booze, big alcohol. in particular, the National Beer Wholesalers Association, Anheuser-Busch, Wine and Spirit Wholesalers of America, the makers and distributors of these beers, wines, and liquors, are facing stiff competition from newly deregulated microbrews and craft distilleries. But cannabis prohibition shuts out another competitor with far fewer short and long-term health risks. So the industry, the big booze industry, is donating millions of dollars to reelect politicians for a public safety on a public safety first platform who specifically oppose cannabis legalization efforts. And these efforts are well documented. Another one is, as the foundation calls it, the Boys in Blue, the National Fraternal Order of Police, National Association of Police Organizations, American Federation of State, County, and Municipal Employees, or AFSCME. These local law enforcement entities have become highly dependent on federal and state money devoted specifically to the war on drugs and civil asset forfeiture from, which is a legacy of the 1984 drug war omnibus crime bill. That allows local police departments to keep a huge percentage of the property seized in suspected drug activity. So, the drug war for law enforcement is hugely beneficial and lucrative for them. So they have no interest in supporting legalization.
Last year, the police confiscated and more cash and property than citizens lost to theft to criminals.
Well, that doesn't surprise me. It's billions of dollars. Closely aligned with that is the prison industrial complex. The Association of Administrative Law Judges American Federation, there's Ask Me Again. Private prison companies and state institutions are lobbying for longer mandatory sentences, stricter enforcement, and corrections jobs, which are a major source of employment in rural areas. Prisons contract for an occupancy rate, charging taxpayers for unmet quotas. So the more people are arrested for marijuana annually, the better it is for these for the prison industrial complex.
Wow.
And the fact is, more Americans are arrested every year for cannabis use than for all violent crimes combined.
It's ridiculous.
It's just ridiculous.
So are you saying that police departments have to maintain so many arrests to maintain a certain budget?
That's right. They get paid basically based on occupancy rate per inmate. And the taxpayers get charged back for quotas that are not met. So it's very lucrative for them. So they're fighting to keep the federal ban on cannabis as well. Another one that you might suspect, Big Pharma. Many of the big pharmaceutical companies, AstraZeneca, Merck, Eli Lilly, Pfizer, the manufacturers associations, these products are very expensive. Many have life-saving effects, but also a lot of life-altering side effects, many of which are avoided with cannabis. And so, of course, they have a vested interest in keeping these remedies out of people's hands. And, of course, last but not least, there's the big government. Government employees unions, federal employees associations. These groups are heavily vested in keeping cannabis enforcement programs in place. marijuana prohibition is a $20 billion annual federal jobs project.
Wow.
It's huge.
Ridiculous.
Departments and agencies are not going to give up their power or their budgets voluntarily. They're going to fight.
They never do.
For every one of the $27 billion in assets that they've seized and the federal jobs that they have. And
so the DEA seized $27 billion in assets in 2014, and their budget is $3 billion.
Right.
So the $30 billion the DEA, and that's a lot of money for a year.
Well, yeah. I mean,
but the overwhelming majority of it is money they take from the public.
It's like Senator Everett Dirksen once said, $1 billion here and $1 billion there, and pretty soon you're talking real money. So they're fighting tooth and nail. So the question is, are we gonna who's gonna come out ahead in this? The people who stand for liberty or the lobbyists?
Right.
There's a lot more to be said about this, and we can go into each one of these special interests in great detail, and perhaps in future episodes we will. But that's just kind of an overview of who stands to gain by keeping marijuana federally illegal.
There's an interesting poll that CBS released on April 20th this week. The poll, as everyone expects, 65%, 67% of Americans believe in adult use should be legal. However, the interesting part of the poll is in the backside. 56% said that the issue would not sway their vote for a candidate to cross party lines. So in other words, like Phil said before in earlier shows, it's not a primary topic for most people towards their vote. So that, they may feel very strongly that it should be legal, but if they're going to vote Democrat or say Republican, they're not going to jump over and vote for a Democrat because of weed. That's basically what the poll surmises.
I think in the 2020 elections and the presidential elections, cannabis is not going to be that much of an issue because so far everyone who's declaring they're running for president is more or less pro-pot. But cannabis will be an issue on the state and local level. I think that's where you're going to, and in certain states.
And one thing that's interesting, this is a bit of an analysis in the article. One thing that's interesting that they said could turn everything is ballot initiatives. In states where they have ballot initiatives, they give the example of Florida. They say that should there be a ballot initiative for adult use at the time of the 2020 election, that very likely could swing the whole state to Democrat because it would bring out so many young voters. So a ballot initiative is different from just the polls, or voting for a president or voting for a politician. If there's a ballot initiative, they say that's going to bring a lot more people out for that initiative, in which case they would likely vote along, more than likely in the younger voters, Democratic line. So that could really swing the vote in a couple of big states. So they're surmising that some states and some, especially the Democratic Party in a few states, may be trying to time this at just the right way to get those ballot initiatives on in those particular states.
The 2020 ballot.
That would make a lot of sense because in the last several election cycles, Florida has been the swingiest of swing states.
Definitely, back and forth.
And Republicans and Democrats have gone back and forth by the slimmest of margins. And something like this, a few thousand votes, 10,000, 20,000 votes here and there, could make all the difference.
Oh, yeah. I mean, look at Bush Gore.
Well, something similar is happening in Nebraska. And now the state legislators have rejected another proposal to roll out a state medical marijuana program. And even though it was like highly restrictive and limited to just lotions and oils, no smoking, they said no way. But what's happening is now the citizens are going to put together a ballot initiative, and their ballot initiative says a doctor can write a medical cannabis prescription for whatever reason he wants. So the Republicans, instead of if they're so against it, they would roll out some kind of program. But they asked the governor, and the governor says, I'm not for it, and I'm not going to support any legislation for it. And if the voters want it and they go for a ballot initiative, I'm not going to sign legislation just because they threaten a ballot initiative.
Well, I could bite him in the ass.
At that point, you're wondering, whose side are you on, dude? Whose side are you on?
Well,
well, thanks. Okay.
And at some point, you not only whose side are you on, but how do you claim to represent your state if the voters are telling you one thing and you're saying absolutely not?
Yeah.
Well, that's what happened in Oklahoma. They wouldn't pass it, so a ballot initiative went through. And, I mean, they were actually negotiating just like CBD only kind of deals, I believe. And the ballot initiative came by, and now in Oklahoma, you see billboards set up, and same-day delivery for medical marijuana dispensers.
So an announcement was made this week, in fact, a couple days ago, that is pretty interesting. $3.4 billion acquisition deal. And the deal is between Canopy Growth. They signed an agreement to acquire Acreage Holdings. Now, this article is in Forbes magazine by Mike Adams, and it's somewhat of an analysis of this transaction. And he's speculating, he's surmising from the information he's gathered with the understanding that Acreage Growth, who's associated with Acreage Growth, guys? John Boehner. John Boehner's on the board, and he's paid quite a bit of money from them. He's very much behind the States Act that Phil talked about in the last episode. He's also a chairman for the National Cannabis Roundtable. So the deal is $3.4 billion, but there's a contingency in there that the deal takes place, moves forward once federal legalization is complete. But with that said, there's also a down payment of $300 million that's due immediately. Anyway, the speculation in that this gentleman, Mike Adams, is making is that Boehner has an in, and he knows something's about to happen in the next year or so, and that some sort of federal legalization is forthcoming. So
wait a minute. So since John Boehner is so connected with the Republican Party, is there a chance that the Republicans before the 2020 election are going to deschedule cannabis to take it off the ballot and make it a sort of a more of a non-issue during the 2020 elections, therefore taking the wind out of the sails of many Democrats?
Well, I think the point here is that if someone would know that, it could very well be John Boehner.
Yeah, that's right.
And
right.
So maybe that's what the impetus of this, $300 million due at signing deal.
So there's a deal being made.
That's a speculation. He closes the article out by saying, if you're reading between the lines, this contract between Canopy and Acreage was signed presumably because Boehner has the 411 on the Congressional Cannabis Chatter and has convinced all of the parties involved that U.S. pot prohibition is coming down, and very likely soon.
The legal cannabis industry, by all accounts, is on the verge of exploding. Many Wall Street analysts are predicting global cannabis industry sales to be somewhere between $50 and $75 billion a year by the end of the next decade. What is less certain is whether now is the right time to invest in so-called pot stocks, and if so, how deeply and which ones. Today we're talking with writer, investor, entrepreneur, and really one of the most inspiring speakers I've encountered, Codie Sanchez. Codie started her career as a journalist before turning to investing, then promptly launched and sold her first startup while still in her 20s. Today, Codie manages over $1 billion in international investments, and we are thrilled to have her as our guest on VoteProPot-Cast today. Welcome, Codie. How are you?
I'm great. Thank you so much for having me. What a kind introduction. I'm going to have to send that over to my mom and my significant other so they can be reminded of that.
Well, sometimes they need reminding, right? Well, we're really glad to have you, and really glad we connected. Now, before we get to talking specifically about investing in cannabis industry. I want our listeners to get to know you a little better because I find you absolutely fascinating. Your business acumen, it seems to me, is as much an expression of your unique outlook on life as it is your financial expertise. For example, you refer to yourself as an adventure capitalist. What does that mean exactly?
Sure. Well, it's very, very much stolen from one of my sort of mentors in this space. I don't know if have you ever read Adventure Capitalist? It's actually a book and another book called Investment Biker. Do either of those ring a bell with you? Okay.
No, but I will definitely check them out.
You're going to have to. So Jim Rogers is the author of both of those books, and Jim would be famous for being one of the co-founders of the Soros Fund with George Soros. And so, he's a prolific investor and has been in this game for a long, long time and made, a plethora of wealth for himself. And I got to know him when I was doing more investing in emerging markets. And that really centered on this idea of when you go against the grain and go to where maybe most people say you shouldn't invest is typically where you make money as an investor. And it's very hard to do because there's all this noise and people are constantly telling you, to be more mainstreamed. But what I learned from Jim and most of my favorite investors is that you should really follow your curiosity. And anytime you find everybody else agreeing with you on where you're investing, you're probably in trouble. And it's probably too late. And so that's what it's termed by a venture capitalist, is seeing it with this mind of a contrarian and having this curious outlook. And namely at the time, I started most of my business investing in emerging markets and largely in Latin America. And so, it was a little bit of the Wild West and still may be in some aspects. And now, after I've taken on this role as a partner at Cresco Capital, which is a cannabis private equity fund, I would say this is sort of a new emerging market.
I would say so.
That's why I'm intrigued. Yeah.
Yeah. Now, one cannot be very risk averse to have that kind of mindset because I would imagine it is fraught with risk. So you've got to be a little bit daring and to go where people they're not going there for a reason,
I think so. I mean, how I've always invested is sort of barbells, which is pretty traditional in the institutional realm. So without getting too technical and boring, on one end you have your sort of cash and very quote-unquote safe investments, municipal bonds, long-term debt where you hold the actual debt as opposed to a fund. And then on the other end of the spectrum, I've always invested in things where I have an unfair advantage. What I don't believe in very much, and I increasingly have believed in it less as I get older, is that investing in the broad-based stock markets are the best way to go. In fact, I don't think that's the truth at all. And what we find is most of the wealth comes from private markets, whether that's private real estate, private equity, venture capital, or these investors like Warren Buffett, who invest individually themselves in big companies where they only invest when they have, it's not insider information, we call it intimate information of a company. And I think the biggest fallacy is that, you are safe if you put all of your money into the broad-based indices because post-2008, we see they're all highly correlated.
Okay. Well, that's very intriguing. Now, tell me more about gaining an unfair advantage. I mean, you've been described, I think someone once described you as taking a subversive approach to serving your clients and your causes. What do they mean by that?
Sure. So an unfair advantage in my perspective is, first of all, I think you should only invest in things where you really understand the underlying business. So, it all starts with having an understanding of the business that you invest in. So anytime I want to build my unfair advantage, I always start with surrounding myself with the people who are most intelligent in that space, that are deeply, deeply engaged in that space only. So if we take cannabis, for instance, I started investing in 2014, And the way that I started was one of my good friends was launching a fund. So I said, okay, I'm going to give you some money, help seed this fund. If you get in early, you typically can give less money, so it doesn't have to be millions of dollars. But I'm going to invest, but I want you to teach me everything that you're learning along the way. And I want to be able to call you and ask you all the stupid questions. So you start with just a knowledge foundation. And then from there, what I've found is it's very easy if you're in a space like cannabis where there's not a lot of money. Even though we see it in the news every day, the industry is still capital starved, no debt, no big institutions can invest in them. It's only really the public market and some private equity players in this space. You can actually get access that normally you wouldn't be able to because all the big VCs would be taking all the money and all the best deals like they do in technology. And so the unfair advantage that we get is we get to see all of these companies, put them through really intensive due diligence, and essentially can predict, based on the fact that we get a lot of information about the company, how it will do in the long term. And it's totally ethical and legal. It's just called private equity investing.
Okay.
And that's
so unfair doesn't mean unethical. It doesn't mean illegal. It just means what the others don't know.
Yeah, perfect example. One of my really good friends who runs a very successful company in tens of millions of dollars of revenue. He's a great guy, and he sent me a screenshot the other day. I can't remember what company it was. Maybe it was Netflix. And he said, gosh, I wish I would have put more money in Netflix. Look what it's done. And I said, his name's Patrick. And so I was like, Patrick, that's price speculating. All you're doing is speculating the price of something is going to go higher. So you want to invest before the next guy comes along because the next guy is going to be not as smart as you are. He's going to invest in a higher amount, and then you're going to get your money and get out, right? He said, well, yeah, that's kind of the thought.
Yeah.
And that, to me, is where bubbles happen, and I would never invest that way. I want to invest because I think the company is going to continue to grow, and I intimately am aware of why, not because some analyst told me on CNBC to invest in Netflix.
You've said that cannabis has one of the biggest market dislocations we've seen. Tell us what dislocation is in that context briefly and what it represents as an investment opportunity.
When I think about the dislocation in the cannabis space, first of all, it's really easy to see in one specific metric, which is I'm nervous about cannabis stocks overall on the public side. But as I said, I'm not a speculator, so I don't make, predictions about if canopy growth is going to go up or down or acreage is going to go up or down. Your guess is as good as mine. But they seem expensive. When you're trading anywhere from 500 to 200 times your earnings, that's pretty expensive. And so what's interesting is the dislocation on that is you can buy into one of those companies for 50 to 200 times their earnings, or you can invest on the private side where you can buy into companies at 3 to 5 times their earnings. In fact, you can sometimes do 3 to 5 times EBITDA. And so that's the dislocation. It's the public versus private space. And then secondarily, the dislocation is we have never before in my lifetime, plus my parents and maybe even my grandparents, we've never before had a market where we have prohibition, which we hear a lot about, right? So we have latent demand already in the market. We have sales that we can already see, and we have companies that are innovating in a myriad of ways, and medicinal and recreational. People compare it to, is it the tech bubble? And my take on that is, no, they were price speculating. Nobody, needed a pets.com at that kind of valuation. They were price speculating. But here we have real numbers that these companies are have in sales. And then we have 4 verticals that they can do it in, from, medicinal to recreational to industrial to, I think in the future we'll have sort of widespread usage for hemp and CBD. So that's the dislocation we have today. Public versus private, and then the fact that we have a prohibition with latent demand and underlying innovation in these companies. And you and I can invest in them, and most of the institutions still cannot invest in them because they have something called a vice clause which means that anything that's federally illegal, they are prohibited by their legal documents to invest. While they have to sit on the sidelines, investors who are still strategic and intelligent about picking the right companies can actually get in the door.
Right, which is why companies like, I would guess, like Aurora, Canopy Growth, Kronos, Tilray, those kinds of companies, they're all Canadian companies. They're getting a head start. So that same illegality question is kind of off the table with them. Is that correct?
Yeah, I mean, I think, and I've invested in Canadian companies and have friends at most of those companies you talked about. I am much more interested in the U.S. companies because of the dislocation in price that the U.S. has as well. There's just a premium placed on Canadian companies because it is fully legal. I mean, BlackRock just bought shares of stocks on the Canadian exchange. And they're in, a few of the exchange-traded funds. So those companies are, I think they still have lots of room for growth, don't get me wrong, but for me, the ones that I think are the most interesting are those still based in the U.S. I mean, our market is so much bigger than Canada. Will those guys come into the U.S. market? Absolutely. But I think there will be a lot of international restrictions that will still allow U.S. companies to really grow.
So whereas that initial huge growth with the Canadian companies, that ship has kind of already sailed. There is that room for growth. I mean, I read an article from Motley Fool yesterday. If you bought Canopy Growth 3 years ago, you'd be looking at about a 2,000% return. Yeah. But maybe that ship has kind of sailed, and the place to be looking are those less highly valued U.S. companies.
Yeah, I was just talking to one of the founders of Tilray, last week. I think they are really intelligent on how they run their business. They're definitely professionals. So, I think there are a few companies in cannabis or in Canada in cannabis that have incredible management teams that will continue.
Funny how those names sound so similar, right?
Right? Yeah. But I do. I think a lot of those companies in Canada will continue to grow. I'm just always interested in, where can I get my unfair advantage? And my unfair advantage is still in the U.S. as opposed to going out and buying a public stock of Tilray, for instance.
Okay. And are there any company names that you would throw out there as being interesting?
I mean, I think all the ones I'm the most interested in are on the private side, where I think you get so if your investors listening today, it doesn't need to be, I'm biased, right? I'm a private equity fund investor and an early stage VC investor. So that's where I see the most opportunity, which means that the only way you can typically get into those is by investing in a fund. So obviously I'm biased to say, you can go invest in Cresco Capital, which is our fund, and get access to the market that way. But if you want to buy the companies individually, I think there's a lot of ways to do that. There's a company called ArcView. And ArcView allows individual investors who are accredited to invest in cannabis companies with some screening and education that comes with it. I think that's an interesting way to do it. I also think, there are companies like Acreage, which is a U.S.-based company. We invested in them. And I think they have a lot of room to grow. Simultaneously, I think one of the best parts about this cannabis business is if you're investing in it, it's not about getting a quick buck, in my opinion. What you should be doing is looking at this space and trying to get visibility into it. Like, what is happening in this industry to see how could my business position to this? How could my investments position to it? So if you're going to do that, I would say, you can invest in some of the public cannabis stocks for sure. But where you're really going to learn is by digging into some of these private companies, even if it's through an ArcView type investment. And those don't have to be big. They could be, a few thousand. And actually feeling and getting to know the companies a little bit. I get nervous when investors want to make stock speculation on underlying cannabis companies. Although,
me too.
Jefferies covers it now. Motley Fool covers it now. Plenty of people cover it. So as long as you're being smart, not allocating too much to that.
in the cannabis supply chain do you see some of the best upside? I mean, you've got the production side, the growers, processors, edibles, manufacturing, and then you got distributors, wholesalers, dispensaries, and then all these ancillary industries, testing, marketing, finance, compliance, all of that. Is there anywhere on that supply chain that you feel there's the most upside?
I mean, I think I can start by where we're not excited in the space. Cultivation. So, if you're purely a grow out there, it's just the name of the game that margin compression is happening in tandem with actual less flower being utilized and more edibles and vape and all of these different mechanisms for using cannabis. So what I wouldn't invest in right now is a cultivation business that was its main focus. It's pure cultivation, and they don't have brands or aren't vertically integrated or don't have something really unique, because at the end of the day, I think about it a little bit like, I don't know, McDonald's. With McDonald's French fries, does the money go to the potato farmer who farms the potatoes, or does it go to McDonald's who eventually sells the fries? And it's 100% the latter. So we're moving away from cultivation and more into brands in the space, I think, are interesting. The vertically integrated plays are super interesting. I think everybody is going to have to figure out how to do lab testing. And lab testing will touch almost all aspects of the industry. So I'm interested in the lab space. And beverages, certainly, I think, are interesting. So I think we're moving up the premiumization of the industry. It's no longer just who can get the cheapest cannabis out there, and much more who has the best story, the best quality, and the smartest product.
Now, Codie, we were very delighted to hear that you shared a previous episode of VoteProPot-Cast with some of your clients, which incidentally, by the way, turned out to be our most downloaded episode until just last week.
Really?
So thank you very much. Tell us about that episode, what you can remember about it. Why did you refer your clients, and what, if any, feedback have you gotten from them?
Well, I think the biggest thing that we're looking for in this space are third-party advocates that are relatively unbiased and professional. I'm sure you can relate to this, but a lot of the people in this space historically were activists, not advocates. And so the biggest thing for us is being able to tell people it's not just us at Cresco saying you should look at this space, seriously consider it. Listen, here we have somebody who's sort of inside the beltway, let's say, who understands a little bit about what's happening from a legislative and policy standpoint and is sharing that perspective. And look, there are legislators on the podcast actually speaking about, the cannabis industry overall. So I think, your podcast, I really like Canna Insider. And I really like MJ Biz, all as news sources for cannabis that I think are unbiased and professional. And that's not been the norm up to this date. I mean, you have great policy groups who are activists, but, you can't be wearing tie-dye and having weed slogans all over everything if you take it hugely seriously anymore.
Well, and I'm glad that you say that, and that's good company that you've put us in, and that was really kind of our intention from the beginning. So I'm glad that you feel that way. Now, just in general terms, whether it's investing, starting a business, or really anything, you advise people to focus first on the why instead of the how. Tell us a little more about that. Like we talked about a little bit with McDonald's, and I don't know if they're a why-centric company to explain it as much, but I think this industry, like every other industry, will have premiumization, which means the ones who succeed will be the ones who are able to offer a product that's truly differentiated. And so all the portfolio companies we're looking at, there are two things that I want to see. One, the biggest reason that companies do not succeed in startup and even later stage, mid-stage mode
is not because they couldn't sell their business, their product, or they couldn't get enough money, or whatever the case may be. It's typically because the entrepreneur gives up is the number one reason. And so when I'm talking,
really?
Wow. Yeah, and so that's why a lot of investors won't invest unless you have two co-founders. That's very often a metric that they mandate. And in tandem with that, I think if you are the entrepreneur, it is not going to be enough for you to see, $100 million in dollar signs for you to get up every day and do this grind that is entrepreneurship, because it is brutal. I mean, I've done it a few times in businesses. I've seen, hundreds of portfolio companies do it, and it is just not the easiest way to make money by far. And so that you have to have a why that is big enough to get up every single morning just for yourself. And then second, for the end user, I mean, I think Simon Sinek said it perfectly, and start with why. That is how people buy. And the most successful companies will be the ones that have a story that they can sell to end users that allows them to do it at a price that allows the company to make money. And if all you have is the what, here is cannabis and you can utilize it, then as the price of the flower goes down, your price will too, and you won't be able to compete in the long term.
Well, I definitely understand that. I've been in marketing. I'm a copywriter, been in marketing most of my professional career, and one of the things we always say is whenever you come up with something about the company, a claim, a benefit, the next thing you should always say is, so what?
Yeah, exactly.
And that's how you get to that why, and telling the story is incredibly important, and it's very good to hear you kind of say that. Now you consider money to be not an end in itself, but rather a tool to be used to accomplish bigger things. What are some of the causes you're involved in that really drive you to be more successful?
This one can be contentious. I was just chatting with somebody the other day who said, do you believe that money is the root of all evil? And I always chuckle at that one. I think that's my generation that we have that perspective. And it's, sort of something somebody could only say if you've been raised in the U.S. your entire life and had all the opportunity that we've had. Because,
exactly.
Once you travel to all these other emerging countries, you realize that, money is really just life sustenance. And once you get to that level where you have enough to provide for your family and maybe make sure you can't fall back into poverty. Once you get to that level, it is just that. My belief is it's a tool, a very powerful tool that applies leverage to the things you care about. So if you are a big believer in, wanting to end human trafficking, that's very hard to do if you don't have a tool like money to apply leverage and work to eradicate whatever your mission is. And so, in my perspective, I'm really big on believing that there needs to be diverse humans in positions of power, and diverse not only of, race and religion and sex, although I think those are easier to move up the chain because you can see them,
right.
But also of diverse types of thought. And I think we're at a little bit of a crisis here in the U.S. with, both sides believing from a political perspective, if you believe one thing, you're a terrible human. And if you believe the other thing, you're a terrible human. And we just can't speak between the two. And so I think we need diverse people in positions of power. So I hire very much based on that. And then the second initiative that I have and why I'm so big on cannabis overall is, my significant other is active duty military. And we're very involved in working with those veterans who have PTSD or TBI or depression and getting them off opioid cocktails and off opioid addiction with cannabis and varying wellness treatments. And so, who would have thought that we would start this in Dallas, Texas, in one of the most conservative states in the country, except the only thing Texans love more than Texas are veterans. And I think they're waking up to the fact that, cannabis can help veterans, and that this opioid that we are selling them kills them.
It does, I think those are two very wonderful causes. And
thank you.
I'm very grateful for you and folks like you. So what's coming up for you, Codie? Any events, appearances we should know about?
Life in private equity is a series of conferences, really. So I'll be at O Cannabis, which is in Toronto. I'll be at Cannabis Dealmakers Summit, which is in San Diego. YPO has an event called 420 in Aspen. So I'll be at, I think that's the next, let's call it 6 weeks or something like that. Because right now we are finalizing the fundraise for our second cannabis fund. So that'll close out by the end of May. And then we will launch Fund 3, which will be sizably bigger.
Sounds wonderful. And we will add some of those links to our show description.
Fantastic.
Tell us where folks can find you and your business.
Sure. I think the best place to find me is Cresco Capital Partners.
Okay.
And that's CRESCO. I'm also on Instagram at Codie Sanchez, CODIE, and always interested in connecting with others in this space, certainly. And I'd love to hear from you too, selfishly, my last question. Going back through your podcast, who has been some of the legislators or the policymakers that you found most interesting on this subject? I'd love to know.
Well, one is someone who I was never a big fan of in the past, John Boehner, who is now getting involved with a cannabis firm himself, and being on the conservative side of the spectrum. Part of my mission here is to get the people on my side of the aisle to embrace this, because it really is, to me, a civil rights issue. It's a individual liberty issue, and that's what I'm all about. I'm all about freedom, and I think John Boehner is kind of pushing it from that angle too. On the opposite end of the spectrum, we heard from Keith Stropp, who is the founder and now legal counsel for Normal. Mm-hmm. And he brings, the kind of tie dye and love beads perspective to things, but it's a legitimate perspective. Yeah. So, this is about individuals being able to pursue their happiness in the way that they want, and it should not be a left versus right issue.
I couldn't agree more. I think that comes from, I'm a big states' rights and individual liberties person myself. It's interesting. I was just listening today to a couple guys who think that there will be full legalization by the end of the year. I don't know if I think it's going to be that fast.
No.
Yeah.
I mean, things are moving fast, but I don't think they're moving that fast. But I did predict at the beginning of the year, we gave our predictions. I don't know if you heard that cannabis will be taken off Schedule 1 in 2019. That may have been a bit ambitious too, but we'll just have to see, because I think there is movement in Congress on both sides of the aisle, and I think the president would be willing to sign it.
Yeah, I totally agree. It'll be interesting as well. And in Texas, we're working very closely with the group, trying to figure out some way to get research surrounding cannabis usage for veterans with PTSD, to get some sort of medicinal allowance in Texas, where at this point they have a very, very limited medical allowance just for a specific type of epilepsy. So we're working with the local legislature, and it's been interesting. When we first started, I think we thought, well, this is sort of our passion project, and it's the right thing to do, and it's not enough to just educate people about it, because they're going to be criminals if they do this. And so, but we thought our chances were pretty limited, to be perfectly honest. And now there's been something like 63, 66 different bills put before the Texas legislature, all regarding cannabis.
Yeah. Wow.
So we'll see. But it seems like something will pass. I think we just hope it's intelligent and aligned to veterans and those who have medicinal needs. So we'll see.
I agree. And that is a fascinating topic, and it's one that I would love to explore with you at some point. We'd love to get you back on here and talk about that. And
count on it.
And you know what's going on in Texas, because you know we keep our listeners up to date on a state by state basis as much as we can, but there's so much going on, so we need all the help we can get.
Couldn't agree more. Well, yeah, we will absolutely do that. As we get closer, I'll make sure to harass you guys and keep you updated as there are updates in the legislature. We should know more into May when things really kick off.
Well, I'm looking forward to it.
Awesome.
We are speaking with venture capitalist Codie Sanchez. Codie, thank you so much for taking the time out of your busy day to speak with us. And we will, like I said, put your information on the show description. And we look forward to the next time we have an opportunity to chat.
I had a blast. Thank you for having me.
Well, that's it for episode 40 of Vote Pro Podcast. Thank you all for joining us today. Once again, we want to encourage everybody to stay informed, get involved, be part of the process. There's many ways you can do that, and we list several of them on our website, VoteProPot.com.
You can send us an email at podcast@VoteProPot.com or call our message line at 240-257-2441.
Please like and follow us on Facebook, LinkedIn, and Twitter. Just do a search for Vote Pro Pot.
Wish I was up in Vancouver at the Cannabis Cafe, smoking good old Sensimilla at the beginning of the day. But here I am in New York City, hiding out in Central Park, getting kidnapped by the police today sometime before dark. But I wish I was up in Vancouver at the Cannabis Cafe, smoking good old Sensimilla at the beginning of the day. The judge looked down upon me, frowned. He said, kid, get on your way. Just don't start out your morning with espresso and a J. I said, I wish I was up in Vancouver at the Cannabis Cafe, smoking good old Sensimilla at the beginning of the day. Hitched on out to Portland, caught a ride up to BC, took the bus over to the neighborhood to have a bowl with my coffee. Now I'm up in Vancouver at the Cannabis Cafe, smoking good old Sensimilla at the beginning of the day. Smoking good old Sensimilla